Hello, New York Giants fans. And yes, I know there are still some of you out there, despite the way that the 2024 season is going for the Giants. Welcome to a new edition of the Valentine's Views podcast here on YouTube. Please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. And I'm here as always, the day after a Giants game with Big Blue Views Tony DelGenio, and we will talk about the Giants' latest loss, the season of misery continuing. Before we get into that, I hope you guys all had a great Thanksgiving holiday, and I hope that Giants football didn't put too much of a damper on it. Anyway, Tony, how are you? Hope you had a great Thanksgiving, and good to see a somewhat of a smile on your face this morning.
I had a nice Thanksgiving. I hope you did too, Ed. And well, we had turkey yesterday twice on the dinner table and on the TV.
Yeah, well, not as bad of a turkey as as the Giants showed us on Sunday, but still, when bottom line, when you look at it, yet another game that's probably winnable, and the Giants fall to 2-10, and now 1-6 in one-score games, 1-7 in games decided by 10 points or less.
Yeah, and it's a matter of attrition now. I mean, they're getting injured in so many places, and the terrible losses are piling up, partly because the guys that they're putting out on the field are just the second stringers, and they just do not have depth on this roster at all, so that when key people go down, they don't have someone to replace them with. And I think you're seeing that. Obviously, we're seeing that at the quarterback for all the complaints about Daniel Jones. I think it's clear that Daniel Jones was still the best quarterback that they had on the roster this year, and I don't think that's a big surprise. But what we're seeing now is on the offensive and defensive lines, they're just decimated, and the guys they have backing up are just not guys who are ready to play.
Right. The big picture really isn't about the result on Thursday. The big picture is about the futures of Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen. The big picture is about how do they get out of this? How do they fix this? How does it change? And I wrote a little bit this morning about that talent drain. They got rid of Daniel Jones. Obviously, as you said, don't have an equal or better quarterback on the roster. Won't until sometime next year, if then. Got rid of Nick McLeod. They've now seen Andrew Thomas, Azeez Ojulari head to IR for the season. Probably lost Dexter Lawrence for the season last night. I don't know how it gets better for Brian Daboll. I don't know how it gets better for Joe Schoen. We look around the league and we see Leonard Williams and Julian Love playing well in Seattle. We see Saquon Barkley having an MVP caliber season and embarrassing the Giants on a weekly basis. We see Xavier McKinney doing something the Giants seem completely unable to do as a team, which is intercept passes. So it just gets worse and worse and more embarrassing for the Giants. And at least over the next 5 games, I don't know about you, Tony, but I have no idea how it gets better for the New York Giants over the next 5 games.
Yeah, I don't think I see a path for it getting better, because I mean they're playing beatable teams. So next week they have New Orleans, I believe, right? And and the Saints are a very beatable team with their own big problems. But you just look at the lineup that the Giants can put out there right now, and who's going to be on the field next week. On the defensive line, I mean, they're going to have to be playing cornerbacks on the defensive line.
They finished. They put Armon Watts, a mid-season acquisition, on IR this week after he got injured on Sunday. And amazingly, you know, this is a guy they basically picked up off the street. And you can argue that he was their second best defensive lineman. You know, and yesterday they not only lose Dexter Lawrence, they lose Rakeem Nunez Roches, they lose DJ Davidson,
And they
and they're
lost
left.
Watts, right?
Yeah, and they, you know, and
Yeah.
they lost Watts to IR. You know, and you look at it, and you know, Jordan Riley and Elijah Chapman played most of the second half. The only defensive lineman that the Giants had.
Mhm.
And you know, just terrible. I don't know, you know, and they're certainly not going to be able to pick up quality defensive linemen at this point in the season. So I don't know how that gets any better. I don't know how the offense gets any better. You know, what I wrote this morning is it just has to get better. Daboll has to make it better somehow if Daboll wants to see year 4. And I don't know how he does it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was going to, and we've talked about the defensive line, but I mean, the offensive line, while not being in as bad a shape as the defensive line, but if you're looking at yesterday's game, they're putting out their 2 backup offensive tackles out there against the Dallas team that has Micah Parsons, you know, and so it's like, you know, it's game over before the game even starts, and Micah Parsons did what Micah Parsons always does, right? And now there it's not quite as bad because Jermaine Illuminor is insisting that he's going to be ready for next week, and he thought he might even be ready this week, and so they'll have one of those 2 positions fixed. I don't know how long it will take Tyree Phillips to feel like he's up to game speed that they can promote him to the 53, but he was a capable offensive tackle for them last year when he played. And so, you know, maybe things will be getting better on the offensive line than they have been. And so you can see some hope there. But on the defense, as you say, the defensive line, which wasn't good to begin with in the interior, you know, is just decimated. And you know, unless unless Kayvon Thibodeau finally starts to have some impact games, and Brian Burns stays healthy and he starts to have some impact, then they're not going to be able to do anything with the pass rush. And so, you know, what I personally feel about Brian Daboll is that while he's made some mistakes, and I mean, I could go through the mistakes, you know, that I think he's made. I thought taking over the play calling was a big one first of all, but that's a story for another time. You know, the fact is he just does not have a lot to work with on that offense, and he's never had the quarterback that he needs to succeed. He has only for a little while had an offensive line that he could succeed with, and you know, and they have some skill players, but with the offensive line the way it is, and with the quarterback situation the way it is, they're they've got Malik Neighbors playing like a possession receiver rather than a game breaker, right? I mean, they're not sending him 20 yards downfield. They're not sending him on post routes, and you know,
and when they do, Tony, when they do, they get a 29-yard completion that comes back because of a penalty.
Right.
They had 3 basically explosive plays yesterday, 1 to Neighbors, 2 from Tyrone Tracy. They had 3 explosive plays that came back because of penalty. They can't get out of their own way.
And what I will say about yesterday's game is that unlike the week before, when they gave every appearance of just laying down and dying against Tampa Bay, they played with heart yesterday. I mean, they tried yesterday, right? They were, and granted, Dallas is not a good team this year, but they played. They tried to win the game, even when they fell behind 27-10. They kept playing, and they got to within 27-20. And if Brandon Cooks doesn't make a really nice catch on that little 3-yard out pass on 3rd down and 3, they get the ball back with just under 2 minutes to go and a chance to tie the game. And so, the fact is, with them being the walking wounded on both the offensive, now especially the defensive lines, they're still in that game yesterday. And so if I am Mara and Tish, and I wish I were, but but if I were just talking about the football side of things, never mind the money side of things, then I think that's what I'm looking for the rest of the season, to see whether Dable can keep the players playing hard, or whether it looks like they've given up on him. Because once the head coach loses the players, then I think the die is cast. And so it could keep on going like yesterday's game, with them just losing the rest of their games this year by close scores, or at least most of them by close scores. And I think they still might bring him back and likewise keep Joe Shane. But if this really kind of spirals downward into just losing, by 30 points every week, that's when I see you're going to make a change. And if that happens, I really think it would be a shame, because they're far from guaranteed in getting something better, never mind even as good as what they have now.
Right. And that the hard part of the whole thing, from the perspective of blowing this up and starting over again, is I get asked all the time about separating Joe Shane and Brian Dable. And John Mara says that he can, but I'm not sure that he should. All right. Even if he thinks he can, because we've seen before when ownership hired Joe Judge to work with Dave Gettleman, and that wasn't Dave Gettleman's choice. Even the day that I remember going to Joe Judge's press conference, the day that he was introduced as Giants head coach. And we asked Dave Gettleman, because Gettleman didn't hire Judge, and they were 30 years different in age, and they saw a lot of things differently. And we asked Gettleman, who wasn't a great general manager, and I'm not defending Gettleman, but I just remember this. We asked him how this was going to work, because they were different, and this wasn't Gettleman's hire. And he said, it'll be all right. He basically said, his point was, Gettleman always used to say, I'm here to serve the coach. I'm here to be support staff for the coach. And he was trying to say, I'll make it work, but that's the situation. And it didn't work. I think the Giants for 2 years tried to tell us that the relationship between Gettleman and Joe Judge was solid. We learned after the fact, or near the end of Joe Judge's tenure, that it was anything but. Okay. And we're going back over old history here, but I'm doing it only to make a point, is that when you have the GM and the head coach on separate tracks, then you don't necessarily have a GM and a head coach who work together. When you hire them separately, and the coach isn't necessarily the GM's guy, then maybe what you wind up with is guys who see things differently, and guys who wind up pointing fingers at each other. Shoot, Tony, I go all the way back to when Tom Coughlin was head coach. Ernie Accorsi was the GM. Okay. And when Ernie Accorsi retired, of course, Jerry Reese became the GM, and Jerry did a really good job in his first few seasons. And I know people think I hate Jerry Reese and I blame Jerry Reese for everything, but to me, this split between head coach and GM happened with Coughlin and Reese too, because Jerry had one vision, which was a new school sort of forward-thinking way that he wanted to build the roster. And Tom Coughlin had a different vision. And what happened was Tom Coughlin ended up trying to coach a lot of players that he probably wouldn't have actually wanted on his roster to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't run an organization that way. So how do you separate, to spin it back to today? I find it very difficult to separate Joe Schoen from Brian Daboll. And what that means is if you're going to blow it up, you're going to blow it all the way up and start over again. And that means it's 3 or 4 more years down the road, probably, before we know if that works.
Right. And that's the problem. You have no guarantee that it's going to work. And, if you look around the league and ask, who's been successful in rebuilding their team and who hasn't, you find, I think, more examples of teams that haven't been successful than teams that have. You have a few examples, like Houston, for example, but the best examples, I think, of teams that have rebuilt are teams that have managed to do one great thing, and the one great thing that Houston managed to do, and this was before the current head coach got there and GMs, they managed to make a trade with Cleveland where they got an outrageous amount of draft capital
that they used to get their quarterback.
But not just to get their quarterback, right? And let's face it, they were lucky to get their quarterback, if you believe that CJ Stroud is the best quarterback out of that draft, which he seems to be at this point, although he's not having as great a season this year as he had as a rookie. But they were lucky because they were the number 2 pick, and Carolina could just as easily have taken Stroud, but they took Bryce Young instead. So, but what they got was a haul of high draft picks that they used to kind of redo their entire roster with a lot of good players. That's a rare thing to have happen, and the Giants are not in a position to make any kind of a trade like that with anyone. You just don't get that shot very often.
It's interesting, Tony, that you use the word lucky. Dan Hatman of the Scouting Academy is a guy that I've known for quite a while, and Dan scouted in the NFL for a while, worked for the Giants, worked for the Philadelphia Eagles. The Scouting Academy now is a place that teaches and develops, a lot of guys who are scouting in the NFL now and in college now. And Dan's well connected around the league, and he knows what's what. And Dan always tells me that you can have all of these plans and everything that you want, but luck is a big part of it. Luck in falling into a player that you have no right to expect to be a really good player, like Dak Prescott in the 4th round for the Cowboys. And the Cowboys haven't been as good as they would like to be over the years, but Prescott was a 4th round quarterback. Luck, like you said, in walking into an organization where the previous organization that just got fired handed you a treasure trove of draft picks that you knew what to do with. Luck in terms of just falling into a couple of players who become a whole lot more than you thought they might be. When you look at the New York Giants over the last few years, I don't want to say that it's been unlucky, but when it comes to quarterback, for example, the timing has never been right. When they needed a quarterback way back in 2018, Justin Herbert decided not to come out of the draft. Their choices were Daniel Jones and Dwayne Haskins. A year later, they weren't going to draft over Daniel Jones and draft Haskins. And I will guarantee you, and I've said this before, Joe Schoen never expected to be 3 years in and still have Daniel Jones on his roster. He expected to have to blow that up after 2022. And then 2022 happens, and they wind up having to keep Daniel Jones. And it's, for whatever reason, the timing has never been right. it just hasn't fallen the right way. But you do have to have some luck. And when you're, shoot, the other part is when you're a building team, you can't make mistakes, and the Giants have made too many.
Yeah. And I would say where Joe Schoen has made mistakes is in not taking the back end of the roster seriously enough in building the team. And granted, it's you have to be willing to push some costs into the future and do that. And then the other thing you have to say about Joe Schoen, okay, and I think we all forget this too often. We forget it, then we remember it, then we forget it again. Is people say, well, he's had 3 years, but he really has only had 2 years, because his first year he walked in with $40 million in red ink on his ledger, and a bunch of free agents walking out the door, whether they would have wanted to keep them or not, because he just had no money to pay any of their existing free agents, and he had no money to bring in any free agents of note to improve the team. And his big free agent splash in his first year was Mark Glowinski for $5 million. Okay, right, and that's because he was desperate to be able to find anyone that he could bring in at a reasonable cost. He couldn't go shopping for big players. Partly that's his philosophy. His philosophy is to try to put the Giants in good financial health, and so he doesn't do what Howie Roseman does, which is, oh, there's a player I'd like to have on the Eagles. I'll go buy him, and I'll find a way to pay for it in 5 or 10 years from now, after he's long gone from the team. That's what Howie Roseman does. And you look at that Eagles roster, and they've got stars at every position, right? I mean, and even when he makes a mistake, he drafts over that mistake, right? He drafted Carson Wentz. In a few years, he decided he didn't like it. He got rid of Carson Wentz, got Jalen Hurts, who's worked out for him. He drafted Jordan Davis high a couple of years ago, and Jordan Davis turned out to be kind of a very ordinary player who's just kind of like a run stuffer in the middle and no more than that. So he comes back the next year and says, well, I'll take another defensive tackle in the top 10 in Jalen Carter, and that one worked.
Right.
So Shane has not had the chance to do that type of thing because of the financial situation that he inherited. And so it's really I feel it's a little bit unfair to judge him on his entire tenure yet. There's a big but to that we can discuss. But
yeah, and part of the problem, you're right about the first year. The first year was survival. Joe has said in the past, he said there weren't even 5 healthy offensive linemen on my 90-man roster. When I got here. So the first year was about survival for him, and I get it. And the point that you make, like about the Eagles drafting over Jalen Carter, or drafting over Jordan Davis, is valid, except when you make that mistake and you're the Eagles and you already have a solid roster and you already have a playoff caliber team, you can survive that mistake. When you're the New York Giants and you're drafting Evan Neal because you absolutely have to have an offensive tackle who can play, it sets you back a couple of years in your development, when a couple of years later you have to go draft over that offensive tackle again, which is where the Giants are, because you can't make those mistakes to step forward. And it's so difficult when I think about where the Giants are. I know John Mara wants to have patience, but it's so difficult because, as you've said, if you blow it up, you have no guarantee. Shane and Daboll are not dumb people. They have made mistakes. But the hard part is, Tony, if you look at it, I can't find, at least off the top of my head, I can't think of a whole lot of examples of a GM coach tandem that really, has gone 3 or 4 years before really finding success. It's difficult. It's difficult to point to examples and say, well, it worked for this team. If we have patience, even though the last couple of years have been bad, we think these guys will get it done. It's just a really difficult spot. I mean, do you let them draft their quarterback? Have you seen enough evidence that you trust them not only to draft the guy, but to develop the guy, to make it work with whoever they draft? Because the next GM could choose between Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward too.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a mystery where what the Giants are probably going to have to do.
Yeah, and I guess I think about other teams that have been rebuilding, and so I watched one of them yesterday, Chicago, and Chicago looked to me, they changed GM and head coach in the same year, I guess, that the Giants did, didn't they? Right, and so they took Ryan Poles, and Ryan Poles took Matt Eberflus. Well, I think Ryan Poles has done a pretty good job as GM. They seem to have accumulated some talent there. Certainly at the receiving position they have, I think he's done a pretty good job in the defensive backfield. But I think Eberflus has been kind of a disaster as a head coach for them. And despite
he certainly was yesterday.
He certainly was yesterday in that last minute of a game. I can't believe they allowed that to happen. And so I don't know. Minnesota was in the same situation. They look like they're in better position, but I still don't know for a fact. I mean, I think Kevin O'Connell has done a really nice job there as head coach. But I don't know from a personnel standpoint how strong they are, and I think that remains to be seen. They're doing so well this year primarily because Brian Flores has done a great job as defensive coordinator, not because their offense is anything to write home about. And they still, obviously they now have 3 cracks at their quarterback position. They drafted one. They signed a retread in Sam Darnold, who's had a pretty good year for them, and now they've got Daniel Jones naturally. So they've got 3 chances to have a good quarterback, and that's what the Giants have not had under Joe Schoen. So I mean, if I compare those 2 teams, I'd say that's the big deal. Of course, they also started out with Justin Jefferson, who and Joe Schoen didn't start out with anybody, or Brian Daboll start out with anybody like that on their team. So they've had a couple of advantages over the Giants, but what they've done is they've given themselves 3 shots at having a starting quarterback for next year, and they are even contending this year without it. And that's what Schoen has not done for the Giants yet. The other thing I would argue that Schoen has not done for the Giants, and again, you don't know you have one until you get it, is that he hasn't drafted impact players for them. And I think that's really what they're missing. The Giants don't have game changers on the roster. I certainly think Neighbors can be one of those guys, but not until he's got an offensive line and a quarterback that can get him the ball downfield on a consistent basis. But he hasn't brought in impact players for the team, and that I think is part of what they're missing. Guys who sort of like will the team to victory when everybody else is kind of down. And right now I don't know who the leaders on the Giants really are anymore.
It's interesting that you mentioned game changers, Tony, because I get asked every year, should the Giants draft this position? Should they draft that position? What should they go after? And that is almost always my answer. Game changers. They don't have enough of them. And look, I am one who I would like to see Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll stay. If the Giants can find their way clear to justify it, I would like to see them both stay. And it depends largely on whether Brian Daboll can hold this team together the next few weeks. The results aren't going to be great no matter what. It depends on What do John Mara and Steve Tisch know internally about their own culpability in some of the major decisions that have been made, like the Barkley decision, like the Jones decision? Um, it depends how much weight they'll put on this 2024 draft class that Joe Shane just put together, which looks fantastic, despite the fact that I wish there had been an offensive lineman and a defensive lineman in it. But the players they did take look terrific. It's just such a tough situation for the Giants to be in, because you can rehash all of Joe Shane's mistakes. And we can go through Barkley and McKinney and all those things and what we learned on Hard Knocks. And I wrote it the other day, and I don't know if I wrote it really well, but I think that in a vacuum, each one of those decisions over the last couple of years that Joe has made, in a vacuum, there's a solid explanation, a solid basis, a solid reason for those decisions. It's just amazing, though, how decision after decision keeps blowing up on the Giants. I mean, even the recent Daniel Jones decision. Yeah, it wasn't clean. It wasn't pretty. It was never going to be. It was at 2-8. It was the choice the Giants had to make. All right, because they couldn't be on the hook for that $23 million next year, because if they have to pay it to Daniel Jones, that's free agent money they can't spend. So, but it has blown up spectacularly, because Jones lands with a 9-2 team, and the Giants have used two quarterbacks who have been terrible, since. So it's just amazing how these things, to me, just keep blowing up, and the cumulative effect is the organization looks inept. It looks embarrassed. It looks like it's going backwards. But if you go decision by decision, you can find good reasons to support why they were all made.
Yeah, and I mean, I think part of the reason that they've blown up is because of all the injuries, and so they make a decision, lose a player, and then the person who's supposed to replace them goes down himself with an injury, and the things they try to do to improve a particular position, that winds up not working out because of injuries and so on. I have no problems with the way they handled the Jones situation this year.
Right.
Obviously we can go back and talk about the offseason after the 2022 season and the contract that he signed. That's a different discussion. But given where they were this year, I had no problem with them benching him at the break. I do believe that if they were going to do that, they would have been better off doing it right away in the first week of the break, rather than waiting until the team reconvened so that the shock could wear off. Because I do believe that part of what happened last week on the field against Tampa Bay was still the team reeling from what had happened. Absolutely. And not being able to put their hearts into playing the game. But I don't mind at all what they did with Jones, and Jones is now landed in a good situation for himself. So it's not as if they did anything terrible to him. And it's, a lot of the decisions they're making, right, you understand them when they're being made. I mean, everybody talks about the Xavier McKinney situation, but that was something I understood completely. And all the people clamoring for Xavier McKinney to still be in the backfield because he's intercepting all these passes for Green Bay, forget about the fact that he went on an ATV ride during the bye and cost himself half a season when he did something he wasn't supposed to do. People forget that for a lot of his career, he was injured, and when he was playing, he wasn't playing that well until the last half of his walk season. And so I think people forget about the history and they just look at
Right.
the name and they look at what the person's doing now. So as you say, these things make perfect sense when they're doing them, but then if the player goes and succeeds in another place, then it winds up looking bad for the Giants. But to me that's the so-called NFL intelligentsia being as shallow and uninformed as anybody else is, in my opinion.
Yeah, like I said, they're even going all the way back to 2022 and Barkley versus Jones and all of that. And I don't think we will ever know all of the internal discussions and maybe what the initial intent was and all of that. I mean, but when you when you come right down to it, quarterback over running back is a choice that most general managers would make because they would tell you quarterback is more important than running back. The problem is if you pick the wrong quarterback over the wrong running back or the wrong quarterback over the right running back, depending on how you want to put it. But philosophically, you understand that decision. Um, philosophically, you understand letting Saquon Barkley go to free agency, not wanting to pay him that kind of money for a rebuilding team. I mean, my 2 cents is that Saquon Barkley is in the perfect place. Saquon Barkley is in a place that was already built and can take advantage of what he does. He is for the Eagles what he always should have been. He is a finishing piece, just like Derrick Henry is a finishing piece in Baltimore, just like Josh Jacobs is a finishing piece in Green Bay. These guys are not guys you build around. These are guys you finish with. And so philosophically, I don't mind what the Giants did at all. It's just because of what Barkley's doing, because of what McKinney's doing, and because of what the Giants, the truly important part of this, Tony, is because of what the Giants are not doing, which is not winning any games, is why it looks like it's blowing up in their faces. If the Giants had 5 or 6 wins right now, whatever Barkley's doing and whatever McKinney's doing and all of that wouldn't look nearly as bad. It just wouldn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned Baltimore and Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry is a guy who looked like he was slowing down, right? That the years of wearing, and especially the type of running back that Derrick Henry is, you could just imagine that after a while the body just gives out. But he's had new life really in Baltimore, and he looks, I would say, better this year than he's looked in 3 or 4 years. And Baltimore, to me, I mean, it's funny because Baltimore hasn't even made it to a Super Bowl in the last decade. I mean, they won one a decade ago, but this current version of the Baltimore Ravens hasn't even gotten to the Super Bowl, much less won one. Yet, to me, they are maybe the best organization in all of football. I mean, I think if you're going to try to learn from anyone, that they're a good organization to learn from the way they build their team. I mean, they always seem to be having good drafts. They always seem to be making a lot of the right decisions. I think they do clever things in the draft, like the way they got Lamar Jackson and so on and so forth. And so I think there are lessons to be, and they have fairly stable front office. I mean, obviously Harbaugh has been there now forever. I can't remember when he was actually hired by them, but he's been there for a long time, and he's gone through offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators, but he's the one constant. And they've had a lot of stability in their front office, although they lost a couple of people, I think, this year. So there are model organizations out there to look at and learn from. And if I was going to try to learn from anyone, I might try to learn from them.
And it's also interesting. You talked earlier about game changers when we talk about what Joe Shane has done and hasn't done, you can look at his first round picks outside of Malik Neighbors and say that he just hasn't gotten enough out of Kayvon Thibodeau, Evan Neal, and Deontay Banks, which is hard when you're, because that sets you back. When you've got an opportunity to draft twice in the top 10 of your first draft and you don't get a true week after week game changer out of either one of those players, and then your next year you trade up and you get Deontay Banks, and he's not at this point what you hoped he would be, and maybe you pass on an opportunity to draft a Will Levis, who might be your developmental quarterback and has looked pretty good recently for Tennessee. I know that we have a comment that Kayvon Thibodeau has won Giants games single-handedly. Yes, he's won a couple over the space of 3 seasons, but I would argue that Kayvon, on a week-to-week, play-to-play basis, is not nearly the game changer that you would hope for with the number 5 overall pick in the draft, with your first pick of a brand new rebuild. He's not Aiden Hutchinson. He's not TJ Watt. He's not Myles Garrett. He's not, prime Von Miller. He's not that guy. And that's what the Giants were hoping for. And maybe someday he'll turn into that. But to this point, for me, he hasn't been that. And not getting that out of your first round picks, sets you back. The other thing for me that I would argue, when you look at, we can slice and dice all of the Barkley and McKinney decisions and all of that. I look at those offensive and defensive lines for the Giants, and Joe simply hasn't been successful in the offensive linemen that he drafted. Didn't even draft one in 2024, which I sort of understood because he went so heavily on free agency, and yet you leave yourself, as you talked about, with the back end of the roster, you leave yourself with an underbelly of backup offensive linemen where you have no young developmental talent coming. And the most he's ever done on the defensive line is the highest pick he's used in 3 drafts is a 5th round pick on DJ Davidson. And that's not going to get it done. So that's another thing we can, we can pick on as well. But I hope they get to stay, Tony. I really do. I hope they get to stay. I hope they get to pick their quarterback. I hope we see, if they can pick the right quarterback and move forward that way. But I think it's a toss-up right now. I think the ball is up in the air, and I'm not sure which hand it's going to land in.
Yeah, I have no idea at this point what's going to be. And again, I do think it matters how they finish out the season, not in terms of wins, but in terms of being competitive. Because I think it's when the team lays down the way they looked like they did against Tampa Bay last week, when the team starts doing that on a regular basis, that's when I think ownership starts to say we've got to start over, because they've lost the team. But if the team continues to compete and loses close games, then I think they do wind up staying. But going back to the draft, I think I agree with the points you made about the draft. And I think there's a school of thought that says there are certain positions that you should draft every year, whether you think you need them or not. And I would say right now in the NFL, drafting an offensive lineman every year is something you should always do. Drafting a defensive lineman, because I think the interior defensive line, I believe, is becoming more important now, or has become more important now than it had been for a few years before that, when when the edge defenders were kind of getting all the attention. But if you don't have that solid interior defensive line, then you're going to see a lot of what we're seeing this year with the Giants, with teams just running on them at will. And so, I think making sure you find some place in the draft, and not just round 6 or 7, or to draft an offensive lineman or a defensive lineman every year is something you should have as a goal every season that you go into the draft, so that you've always got backups in those places, because you're going to miss on some of them. But if you keep on drafting them, you probably find enough guys to get you through the injuries. And that's what they really don't have. I think their starting 22 coming into the season was not that bad, but what's behind that starting 22 is just really not NFL caliber, and they're seeing it now with all the injuries.
And it's also interesting, Tony. I think I think it's 100% accurate that the way the season ends has a lot to do, or will have a lot to do, with whether Dable and Shane get to stay. There's also an argument to be made when we talk about patience and continuity and stability and all of that. How many of us were really, really good and had all of the answers and made zero mistakes when we first took our jobs? How many of us, had to learn on the fly, and how many of us are better at what we did or what we do? How many of us got better over time, as we learned more and as we analyzed the mistakes that we made and got more experience? So that factors in. I mean, if it's me, I want today, as we sit here, I want Joe Shane and Brian Dable to get the opportunity, to find the quarterback that they can go forward with. I wish that Joe Shane had already put that guy in place. I understand why he didn't last year. I understand why he didn't. And Malik Neighbors is a terrific player, but it sure would be nice if that quarterback was already in place, and the Giants could go out this offseason and look for weapons and look for offensive linemen and look for pieces to put around that quarterback. But right now, I like I said, I fall on the side of crossing my fingers and hoping that the Giants can find their way to some stability, but I just don't know.
Yeah, and this coming draft is a perplexing one, from the standpoint that I see Patrick's comment, let's get that quarterback. And the question is either of the top, generally regarded top 2 quarterbacks worthy of the number 1 or number 2 pick in the draft? Dane Brewer does not think so. He's put out his original, or his first top 50, and I guess we'll see what his final is. But he thinks that Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward are guys that in another year you would draft in the middle of the first round rather than the top of the first round, and so do you use a number 1 or number 2 pick on one of those guys? I would say you probably have to if you're the Giants and that's the position that you're in, but there's no guarantee of what you're getting if you do. I see another question. Would you rather be the Giants or the Jets moving forward? I think that's a really interesting situation. I feel like the Jets have more talent on their team, more game-changing talent on their team right now than the Giants.
I'd rather be the Giants because I don't have to deal with Aaron Rodgers. Okay, let's just put it there.
Don't have to deal with Aaron Rodgers, and you don't have to deal with Woody Johnson. I mean, people who are critical of John Mara, I would suggest to them go talk to your Jets fans and ask them what it's like having Woody Johnson as an owner.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation that the Giants find themselves in. It's not where you want to be, 3 years in, because it just feels like it's getting worse instead of better. In terms of those 2 quarterbacks, debating those two guys, that's another whole hour's worth of a show. I know that most analysts would say that whatever order you put them in, Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward, whatever order you put them in, at best, the number one guy in this draft would have been the number 4 guy in the last draft. The number 4 guy who the Giants passed on, by the way. So that makes it interesting because, now they might be in a situation of having to settle for that quote unquote number 4 guy. But it's the situation they're in. And we'll see what happens. Anyway, Tony, I think that we have prattled on for a very long time. And I think it is a good time for us to call it a show. 5 more of these to do. We're going to 5 more of these to do, Tony. We need to spend some time coming up with some new material.
It could be worse. You could be designing the game plan for the next 5 games.
The very interesting thing before we go, did you think Drew Lock showed enough to start the next 5 games?
Yeah, I did. And I mean, I have no illusions about Drew Lock as a quarterback. I mean, I don't think he's the answer at all for them. But I thought he was under a lot of pressure yesterday, and I thought he handled it well. And I mean, both Locke and DeVito. I wouldn't say any less about DeVito, but just to speak about Locke in particular, he's got a feistiness to him, and a toughness, I think, that you want to see in your quarterback. I think that once Jermaine Illuminor comes back, and maybe if Tyree Phillips gets up to speed and they can start playing him at the other tackle, I think you could actually see with him getting enough time to throw that there are situations in which he can be an effective quarterback. We know from his past that he does not mind at all throwing the ball downfield. And I think that's something that this offense, desperately needs, and something that Malik Neighbors desperately needs for him to feel like he's being used properly. So I would be in favor of them continuing to start Drew Lock. And I don't know what's going on in the locker room, but I could imagine the players feel that that's the right choice also.
Yeah, I would agree, Tony. I think that, yes, there are wild fluctuations with Drew Lock that Brian Daboll doesn't like. And he was clear yesterday that he wasn't thrilled with the turnovers. But I can't fault Drew Lock for the pick 6 at all. That was just a fantastic defensive play. You throw that ball out there, you never expect a defensive player to do what Devarion Overshawn did. The fumble is what it was, and as Tom Brady said on the broadcast, this is a guy who's played very little. This first real time he's played this year, played maybe 1 game last year. Getting hit, having all those bodies around you is something that you have to reorient yourself to. There is a really low floor with Drew Lock because of the fact that he will make those mistakes. But I would like to see Drew Lock given an opportunity to practice with these first team wide receivers. He hasn't thrown to Malik Neighbors in months. He hasn't thrown to Darius Slayton in months. He hasn't practiced with the first team since OTAs. So I would like to see him. And it was clear that the timing wasn't there yesterday. It was clear that a lot of his passes were a little bit behind Malik Neighbors, a little bit over Darius Slayton's head. I'd like to see him get an opportunity to work with, to work with the first team, to start the next few games maybe, just maybe, Drew Lock can be the bridge guy for half a season, to whoever the Giants draft as the next quarterback. I think there's not that there's a tremendously high upside, but I think there's more upside if you stay with Locke. So we'll see what the Giants do. And anyway, Tony, I do think it's time for us to call it a show. This time I actually mean it. I won't throw any more questions at you.
Okay.
All right. So Giants fans, thank you as always for watching. Please stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.